Elizabeth Cooper was 22, and as far as the county recorder in Cedar Pass could tell her, she had inherited nothing. No land, no stock, no money in the bank. Only a broken brass compass her father had pressed into her hand the week before he died, its glass fogged, its needle stuck sideways, as though refusing every direction anyone asked of it. Everyone said the old man had left her with nothing. What nobody knew, not even Elizabeth, was that the needle was not broken at all. It was pointing, and where it pointed would change her life forever. Settle in, stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Because this is a story about a girl who followed a stubborn little needle up into the high valley and found the truth her father had hidden from her for years. To understand why Elizabeth Cooper stood on the porch of the Cedar Pass land office that gray October morning with a broken compass in her coat pocket and nothing else to her name, you have to go back some years, to the small, crooked ranch house 6 miles out of town, where she had been raised almost entirely by her father. Her mother had died the winter Elizabeth turned 4, of a fever that came through the pass and took 3 women and a child in the same week. And Elizabeth remembered her only as a warm shape bending over a lamp and the smell of rose water on a folded handkerchief. After that, it had been her father, Thomas Cooper, a lean, quiet cattleman who had come west from Pennsylvania as a young man and never spoken of what he had left there. He ran 140 head on leased grass and a little deeded ground along the creek, and he worked from before light until after it. And he raised his daughter the way he raised a good young horse, patiently, with few words, expecting more of her each year, and rarely praising her when she gave it. He taught her to ride before she could properly read, and to read not long after. And by the time she was 10, she could saddle her own pony, doctor a cut on a heifer's leg, and find her way home in the dark by the shape of the ridge against the stars. He taught her the names of the grasses and which ones fattened cattle and which ones only looked like they did. He taught her to sharpen a knife on a whetstone with a little spit and a slow figure 8, and to mend a bridle and to sit still in a blind long enough to shoot a deer clean. What he did not teach her was how to speak of feelings, because he could not do it himself. He loved her the way he loved his good bay gelding and his mother's Bible, and the long view down the valley in the evening, steadily, without display, and without ever once saying so. The one person who had said so, plainly and often, was a woman named Hannah Reed, a widow of about 60, who lived on a little place 2 miles down the creek and kept goats and bees and a garden that fed half the neighbors in a hard year. Hannah had been Elizabeth's mother's closest friend, and after the fever she had appeared at the Cooper house every Thursday with bread and soap and, later, with lessons. How to knead dough, how to render tallow, how to keep a wound clean, how to render an account in a ledger and know at once whether a man was cheating you. Hannah did not have children of her own, and she took Elizabeth on the way a good farrier takes on a promising apprentice. Seriously, without sentimentality, and with an unshakable faith that the girl was capable of anything asked of her. It was Hannah who first said, when Elizabeth was 15 and had brought a colicky calf back from the edge, that the child had her father's hands and her mother's stubbornness and would make her own way in any country God chose to set her down in. The beloved object was the compass. Her father had carried it in his shirt pocket for as long as she could remember, a heavy brass instrument about the size of a pocket watch, with a hinged lid engraved with a small pine tree and the initials T.C. worn nearly smooth by his thumb. He had told her once, in one of the rare evenings when he spoke of his own past, that it had belonged to his own father, a surveyor's assistant in the eastern woods, and that it had come across the country in a saddlebag and been dropped in a river and fished out again, and never quite worked right after. The needle, he said, had a mind of its own, and a man who trusted it too far would end up in the wrong drainage. He carried it anyway, and when Elizabeth was small, he would let her hold it in her palm and watch the needle drift, and he would say, without smiling, that some things were worth keeping even when they were broken. He had been sick a long time before he admitted it, and by the time the doctor from Cedar Pass rode out to the ranch, there was nothing to be done except to make him comfortable and to send word to a lawyer in town. Elizabeth nursed him through the last 6 weeks herself, with Hannah coming up every second day to help her turn him and to sit with him while Elizabeth slept an hour at the kitchen table. On the last clear evening before the pain took his speech, he had reached under his pillow and drawn out the compass and closed her fingers around it, and he had held her wrist a moment and said only, "Keep this on you, girl, and follow it when you're ready." She had thought, at the time, that he meant it the way a father means a keepsake, and she had put it in her coat pocket and gone on doing what needed doing, and had not thought of his words again until much later. When the papers were signed and the door was closed, and there was nowhere to go but the direction the needle had already chosen for her, the lawyer's name was Harlan Pettyjohn, and he had come out from Cedar Pass on the 3rd morning after the burial with a leather case tied shut with a bootlace and a face composed for the delivery of news he did not want to give. He sat at the kitchen table where Thomas had eaten his last soft meal, and he laid the papers out in the order he meant to read them, and he asked Elizabeth if she would like Hannah Reed present, and Elizabeth said yes, and Hannah came in from the porch and stood behind her chair with a hand on the back of it, and did not sit. Harlan Pettyjohn read from the top sheet in a voice that was neither unkind nor gentle. Thomas Cooper had held no deeded ground in his own name at the time of his death. The 70 acres along the creek that Elizabeth had always understood to be theirs had been pledged 4 years earlier against a loan from the Cedar Pass Stockman's Bank to carry the herd through the hard winter of the drought, and the loan had been rolled forward twice and had come due in the spring, and Thomas had paid the interest, but had not been able to retire the principal, and upon his death, the note fell due in full. The bank had already filed. The leased grass reverted to the 2 ranchers who owned it. The cattle, 140 head as of the last tally, would be sold at auction in Cedar Pass on the 15th of the month to satisfy the note and the funeral costs and the doctor's bill and the small standing account at the mercantile, and after those were paid, there would, in Mr. Pettyjohn's careful phrase, be nothing remaining for distribution. The house itself sat on the pledged acreage. Elizabeth would have 30 days from the date of the sale to vacate. Elizabeth listened without moving her hands from her lap. She asked one question, which was whether her father had known, at the end, that the note would take everything. And Mr. Pettyjohn considered a long moment and said that Thomas had signed the last renewal in July with a clear understanding of its terms. Elizabeth nodded once. Hannah's hand tightened on the chair back and then loosened. Mr. Pettyjohn set a pen beside the papers, and Elizabeth signed the acknowledgments where he pointed, in a hand as steady as her father had taught her to keep it, and she thanked him for riding out, and she walked him to the porch and watched him mount and go. Then she came back inside and put water on for coffee, and did not speak for some time. She did not go into town for the auction. Hannah went in her stead and came back at dusk, with the tally written on the back of an envelope, and the news that the herd had brought a fair price but not enough, and that after the bank and the doctor and Mr. Pettyjohn's fee, there was, as promised, nothing. Elizabeth folded the envelope in half and put it in the stove. She spent the next 3 weeks doing what her father would have done if he had been the one leaving the place. She swept the barn and coiled the ropes and hung the bridles on their pegs so the next man would find them ready. She scrubbed the stove and the table and the 2 windows. She packed her mother's handkerchief and 3 of her father's shirts and a wool blanket and a tin of matches and a box of cartridges and the little cast-iron skillet Hannah had given her when she was 12. She kept the compass in her coat pocket where it had lived since the last clear evening. On the 29th day, she saddled the sorrel gelding her father had ridden, whose name was Pilot, and who was hers now only because the bank's man had looked at his cracked hoof and passed him over on the tally. And she rode down the creek to Hannah's place with the key to the house in her hand. Hannah did not try to talk her into staying. Hannah was not that kind of friend. She fed Elizabeth a bowl of bean soup and cut her a wedge of yellow cheese and wrapped a loaf of brown bread in a cloth and put it in her saddlebag, along with a small crock of honey and a paper twist of salt and a folded square of oiled canvas the size of a tabletop. She gave Elizabeth $12 in coin, which was more than Elizabeth would take at first, and exactly what she took in the end. And she said Elizabeth could sleep in her loft for as long as she needed a roof. Elizabeth said thank you and said she would come back down in a few days. Hannah looked at her a long moment and said, "Follow what you've got, girl, and come back when you know what it means." Elizabeth did not fully understand her and did not ask her to explain, and swung up into the saddle and rode north along the creek toward the ranch house one last time to close the door behind her. She meant to sleep the night in Hannah's loft. She meant in the morning to ride into Cedar Pass and see about work at the boarding house or the laundry or the seamstress who took in girls for piecework in the winter. She had thought it all through the way her father had taught her to think a thing through, in a straight line without flourishes, and she had decided. But when she rode back up the creek toward the house that evening to shut it for the last time, the compass in her coat pocket began to press against her ribs in a way she had not felt before. She did not know if it was the weight of it or the angle at which she was riding, and she reached in and drew it out and flipped the lid open in the saddle. The needle, which had sat sideways for as long as she could remember, had swung. It was pointing steadily to the northwest, up the long grade of the pasture and past the shoulder of the ridge into the high country above the ranch, where her father had run summer cattle when she was small and where she had not been in 3 years. She turned the compass in her hand and the needle held. She turned Pilot a full circle in the trail and the needle held. It did not drift. It did not tremble. It sat as if a hand under the glass were holding it against the mark. She sat in the saddle a long minute with the compass open in her palm and the light going out of the valley behind her. And she remembered then what her father had said about following it when she was ready. She did not know if she was ready. She knew she had a saddled horse under her and food in her bag and a blanket rolled behind the cantle and nowhere she was owed to be until morning. She closed the lid on the compass and put it back in her pocket and turned Pilot's head northwest and let him climb. The trail she took was the old cattle track that ran up through the aspens behind the barn and switched twice across the shoulder before it opened out into the long benchland above the ranch. It was a track her father had cut when she was 7, widening a game trail with an axe and a mattock over the course of a summer, and she knew every stone in it in the dark. Pilot climbed steadily and without complaint, breathing through his nose in long, even draws, and the last of the day slid off the ridge above them and left the trail cold and blue. She rode with the reins loose and one hand resting on the compass through her coat, and she felt, from time to time, the needle settle a little more firmly against her palm as they bore up the grade. The wind came off the high country the way it always did after sundown in October, thin and dry and smelling of pine sap and cured grass and something farther up that might have been snow on a north face. The aspens were mostly bare, their leaves gone gold and gone brown and gone down into the duff, and the white trunks showed pale between the pines and made a soft corridor for the trail. An owl called once from a snag above the switchback and did not call again. Pilot's shoes rang on a shelf of granite where the trail crossed a seep, and the sound came back off the opposite ridge a beat later, small and clean. She rode 2 hours by the stars and did not stop. When she came out onto the bench, the wind opened around her, and the sky widened, and she saw the whole shape of the country she had known all her life laid out under a rising 3/4 moon. The pale run of the pasture, the darker seam of the creek, the far low glimmer of the lamp in Hannah's kitchen, and beyond all of it, the notched black wall of the mountains rising north. She had never been on the bench at night alone. She had been on it with her father 100 times, riding drag on a bunch of summer cows or checking a spring at first light. And the country looked the same and did not look the same. And she felt for a while less like a young woman riding out and more like a child who had been sent on an errand and had forgotten what she was carrying. She stopped Pilot at the edge of the bench and drew the compass out again. The needle, in the moonlight, still held northwest, but it had shifted a hair to the west of its earlier line, and when she looked along its pointing, she saw only the dark rise of the timber and the pale suggestion of the high valley beyond it, where the summer grass ran out along a shallow creek, and where, she remembered now, there had once been a line shack her father had used in the years when he ran cattle up there alone. She had been there once at the age of 9, on a bright July afternoon with a lunch of biscuits and a canteen. She had not been there since. She could not have said, if asked, whether the shack still stood. She put the compass back in her pocket and clucked Pilot forward. The bench grass whispered against his fetlocks. Somewhere off to the east a coyote opened and was answered, and then the country was quiet again, except for the small, steady sounds of a horse walking through dry grass in the cold. She rode on toward the timber, and the moon rose higher behind her, and she did not look back at the valley she was leaving. The timber closed around her without ceremony, a stand of lodgepole and fir grown up thick along the north face of the ridge, and Pilot slowed of his own accord and picked his way between the trunks by the pale gaps overhead. Elizabeth let him choose. She had ridden through worse country in the dark with her father, and she knew that a horse in timber at night saw more than a rider did, and she trusted Pilot's cracked hoof to hold on the soft duff even where it would not have held on rock. They climbed for the better part of an hour, and the ground leveled, and the trees thinned to widely spaced firs, and then all at once the timber ended, and the high valley opened out ahead of her in the moonlight. Longer and shallower than she remembered, floored in pale grass gone dry with the season, with the black thread of a creek running through the middle of it, and the ridges rising quietly on either side. She stopped Pilot at the edge of the trees and drew the compass one more time. The needle held on a line that carried her eye up the valley about a 1/4 mile to a low, dark shape near the creek, a shape she would have taken at first for a boulder or a downed tree if she had not known what to look for. She closed the compass and rode toward it. The shack sat on a small rise of ground about 30 paces back from the water, tucked into the shelter of 3 old firs, and it was smaller than she had remembered and lower to the ground. It had been built by her father and a hired man over the course of 2 summers, when Elizabeth was 6 and 7, of squared lodgepole logs chinked with clay and horsehair, roofed with split cedar shakes, and floored with rough plank. It measured about 12 feet by 14. It had 1 door of vertical planks hung on strap hinges, 1 small window of 4 panes on the south wall with the glass still sound in 3 of them, and the 4th boarded over with a scrap of tin, and a rusted stovepipe rising crooked through the shakes at the back corner. The chinking had fallen out of the north wall in patches and left pale slots of moonlight between the logs. 1 shake had blown loose along the eave and hung by a single nail. The door, when she pushed it, gave with a shudder against a slack leather latch, and swung inward into a smell of cold ash and mouse and dry pine. She stood a moment in the doorway and let her eyes take the room. There was a rusted sheet-iron stove against the back wall on a hearth of 4 flat creek stones, and a length of stovepipe leaning beside it, come down from the ceiling and never put back up. There was a rope bunk built into the northeast corner, with the ropes slack and gray, and a folded canvas that had once been a bedroll gone to mildew at the foot. There was a small plank table under the window, and a 3-legged stool set beside it, and a shelf on the west wall holding a tin plate, a tin cup, a bent spoon, a stub of candle in a saucer, and a small blue enameled coffee pot with its lid missing. A coil of frayed lariat hung from a peg by the door. On the floor beneath the table lay a scatter of mouse droppings and the scoured shells of pine nuts. Under her boot, the plank floor gave a hollow, dry sound, but it was whole. She led Pilot around to the east side of the shack out of the wind, unsaddled him, hobbled him where the grass was still good along the creek bank, and carried her saddle and bags inside. She spread Hannah's oiled canvas on the plank floor near the stove, laid her wool blanket on it, set the skillet and the bread and the honey and the little crock of salt on the table, and took the stub of candle from the shelf and lit it from a match out of her tin. The small room came up warm and yellow in the light. She swept the worst of the droppings out the door with a bundle of dry sage, drew a bucket of water from the creek in the coffee pot for want of a bucket, and sat down on the stool and ate a piece of the brown bread with a slice of the yellow cheese. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she did not feel that she was in a place she had to leave. She slept that night in her blanket by the cold stove and woke at first light. The valley in the morning was gray and blue and yellow, with mist on the creek and frost on the grass, and the sun not yet over the east ridge. And Elizabeth stood in the doorway with her coat buttoned, and drank creek water from the tin cup, and looked at what she had. She spent the whole of that first day walking the ground. The shack sat well, high enough that the creek would not reach it in the spring, low enough that the wind off the ridge broke on the timber above. There was good grass in the valley for a horse or two, and pine for firewood on the slope behind, and cold, clear water in the creek. Behind the shack, about 10 paces up the rise under the firs, she found a low mound of earth she did not at first understand. A rectangle of ground, some 6 feet by 8, ridged along the edges as if something had been dug and filled in a long time ago. Weathered planks lay across the top of it, half buried in pine needles and duff, gone gray as bone. She had walked past the mound twice before she registered that it was there at all, and even then she nearly went on, because the light was dying and she was hungry, and she wanted to be inside before the cold set in. But she stopped and stood a moment, and drew the compass out of her pocket for what she guessed was the 20th time that day. In the flat light under the firs, the needle held steady on the mound, not on the shack, not on the creek, not on the valley beyond, but on the 6 feet by 8 of ridged earth beneath the weathered planks at her feet. She closed the compass and put it away, and went back to the shack for the axe she did not have, and settled for the flat iron bar she had found leaning against the wood box that morning, and a shovel with a split handle that had stood forgotten behind the door. She pried up the planks one by one. There were 6 of them, cedar, cracked and rotted at the ends, but still whole in the middle, laid across a shallow frame of peeled pine poles set into the earth. Underneath the planks was a layer of straw gone to dust, and under the straw a second layer of split cedar shakes laid tight, and under the shakes a hatch of 2 boards hinged with iron straps and fastened with a wooden peg through a staple. She drew the peg. She lifted the hatch. Below was a black square hole about 4 feet deep, walled and floored with dressed lodgepole, dry and sound, smelling faintly of cold earth and pine, and it was a root cellar, and it had been built with care, and it had been used and closed and covered over a long time ago. She went back to the shack for the candle and matches, and came back and lit the stub and lowered it in. The light showed her a small, square room the size of a wagon bed, with a shelf along one wall and a low bench along the other. On the shelf sat 2 glass jars sealed with wax, one holding what looked in the candlelight like coarse yellow sand, and the other holding the same, and a small tin box the size of a family Bible with a hinged lid. On the bench lay a folded oilcloth packet tied with string. Nothing else. She stood at the edge of the hole a long minute with the candle in her hand before she climbed down. She took the tin box first. It was heavier than it looked. She sat cross-legged on the bench with the candle set in the corner and lifted the lid. And inside, wrapped in a square of soft flannel, lay a stack of folded papers and a smaller envelope with her own name written across it, in her father's plain, slanting hand. She knew the writing before she had drawn a full breath. She sat with the envelope in her lap and did not open it for some time. When she did, she found a single sheet of ledger paper folded twice, and in her father's hand the following, Elizabeth. If you are reading this, you have found what I meant you to find, and I am sorry I could not put it plainer while I was living. My name is Thomas Cooper, and I have worked this country 26 years. I built this shack the summer you were 6, and I dug this cellar the summer after your mother died, when I was up here alone with the cows and had time to think. In the jars is gold dust I panned out of the creek behind the shack over the course of 9 summers, a little at a time, and never enough to draw notice. And in the packet is the filed claim on this valley in your name, dated the spring you turned 14, and the receipt from the assay office in the county seat, and the deposit book from the bank in Fort Larkin, where I have held an account in your name since you were 10 years old. There is enough, I believe, to keep you and to start you. I meant to tell you when you were of an age, and then I meant to tell you when I was well, and then I meant to tell you at the end, and I could not make my mouth do it. The ranch was mine to lose, and I lost it, and I would not have you lose with me. This place is yours, and always was. Follow the compass, girl. It is not broken. It never was. Your father, Thomas. Elizabeth read the letter twice by candle in the close air of the cellar, and then a third time slowly, saying certain words half aloud to hear them in her own voice. And when she was done, she folded the ledger paper along its old creases and put it back into the envelope, and the envelope back into the tin box, and sat on the bench a long while with the flannel across her knee. She did not weep. She had done her weeping in the barn 3 weeks earlier, with her forehead against the neck of a heifer that had known her since it was a calf, and this was not that kind of hour. This was the hour when a person understands that something has been done for them, and that it is now their turn to do the next thing. She climbed out of the cellar with the tin box under her arm, and the 2 sealed jars cradled in her coat, and the oilcloth packet against her chest. And she carried them into the shack, and set them on the plank table in the light coming through the 3 sound panes of the south window, and she looked at them a long minute before she did anything else. The next morning she began. She rode Pilot down to Hannah's place at first light and told Hannah what she had found. Hannah heard her through without interrupting, and then set a second cup of coffee in front of her and said, "Quiet." That Thomas had always been a man who wrote things down and never said them, and that this was the shape of him. Hannah went to a drawer in the pine sideboard and brought out a small carpenter's pencil and a folded sheet of butcher paper, and made Elizabeth list the work in order. Chinking, roof, stovepipe, door, window, bunk, bucket, axe, saw, nails, a second horse for winter, hay for the horses, flour, beans, coffee, lamp oil, and the ride to Fort Larkin to sign the bank book into her hand. Hannah added a line at the bottom that said, "Tell no one in Cedar Pass about the jars, not the assayer, not the bank, not the mercantile, not for now." And Elizabeth said she had already decided that. She rode into Cedar Pass with $2 of Hannah's 12 and bought a keg of 10-penny nails, a pound of 8-penny, a small cross-cut saw with a good tooth, a whetstone, a ball of tarred twine, and a used single-bit axe with a hickory helve that Meg Tuller, aged 51, who kept the hardware counter at the mercantile and had known Elizabeth's mother, sold her for $1 less than the tag and threw in a file for the axe. Meg Tuller said nothing about the auction or the house, only that a good file was worth more than a poor axe, and that Elizabeth should sharpen once a day and not once a week. Elizabeth carried the tools out tied in a bundle across the cantle and rode home the long way so as not to pass the bank. Ned Ashbrook, aged 64, who ran a small sawmill 3 miles below Hannah's place on the same creek and had bought cull steers from Thomas for 2 decades, heard from Hannah that Elizabeth was up in the High Valley fixing a shack, and he loaded a wagon with 24 split cedar shakes left over from his own roof, a coil of No. 9 wire, a bundle of peeled pine laths, and a 50-pound sack of lime, and drove them as far as the head of the switchback with his son Peter, aged 19, who helped Elizabeth pack the load up the last mile on Pilot and a borrowed mule in 3 trips. Ned would take no coin. He said Thomas had once pulled his wagon out of the creek at midnight in April and had not asked to be paid then either. Peter Ashbrook, quiet and long-armed, stayed a day and helped Elizabeth strip the loose shakes off the north pitch of the roof and lay the new ones in courses, driving each with 2 nails and no more, the way his father had taught him. Elizabeth chinked the north wall herself over 4 days, mixing clay from a bank by the creek with fine dry grass and a little of the lime, working it into the gaps with a flat stick and smoothing it with the heel of her hand, and she rehung the loose eave shake, and she replaced the tin patch in the window with a 4th pane of glass wrapped in newspaper that Meg Tuller had sold her for $25 and a smile. She rebuilt the rope bunk with new hemp cord bought by the yard, replaced the mildewed bedroll with clean straw ticking sewn by Hannah, straightened the stovepipe and reset it through a new tin thimble in the roof, and cut a season's worth of firewood from a stand of dead lodgepole up the slope, bucking and splitting with the axe Meg Tuller had sharpened for her and stacking the rounds along the south wall in a rick as tall as her shoulder. On the 5th day, she rode to Fort Larkin with the deposit book and the assay receipt buttoned inside her coat and the compass in her pocket, and she sat 2 hours in the front room of the Fort Larkin Bank while the cashier, a thin man named Alden Purvis, aged 40, verified the account against the ledger and signed it over to her hand, and she came out with the book showing $318.40 in her name. More money than she had ever seen and less than the ranch had been worth, and enough, as Thomas had written, to keep her and to start her. She used part of it plainly. She bought a second horse, a stout bay mare named Juno from a widower named Josiah Renfro, aged 58, who ran a small remount string south of Fort Larkin and threw in a used pack saddle when he heard where she was going. She bought 100 pounds of oats, 50 of flour, 20 of beans, 10 of coffee, a 2-gallon crock, a galvanized bucket, a good lamp, and 2 gallons of kerosene. She filed her claim afresh at the county seat under her own signature, paying the small clerk's fee out of coin and not out of dust, and she took the assay receipt to a different assayer in a different town and had one of the jars weighed and recorded in her own name so that when the time came to sell it, the paper would already exist. The dust in the 2 jars, when it was weighed, came to 11 ounces and a fraction, and at the price posted that week, it was worth a little over $200, which she did not touch. She put the jars back in the cellar under the hatch, and the peg, and the shakes, and the planks, and the pine duff, and she wrote in the front of a new ledger, "Bought for 15 cents, the date and the weight and the price and the words, held against need." By the first snow, the shack was tight. The chinking had cured pale and hard. The roof shed water clean. The stove drew. The bunk held her weight without a creak. The door swung true on greased hinges. The lamp burned steady on the plank table where the tin box now sat closed, and the compass lay open beside it, with its needle steady on the North Pole where it belonged. Having pointed her all the way to the place it meant to point her, and then, its work done, gone quiet. Word traveled, as word does in a country of few people and long winters. By December, the men and women along the creek and up in Cedar Pass knew that Thomas Cooper's daughter was living in the High Valley on a claim of her own, and that she was not asking for anything and was not going anywhere. Meg Tuller kept a small running account for her at the Mercantile against Spring, marked in pencil in the back of the ledger, and would let no one else touch that page. Ned Ashbrook rode up once a month through the drifts with his son to see whether the roof was holding, and each time he came he brought something small he pretended he had no use for. A length of stovepipe, a jar of pickled beets from his late wife's last put-up, a hank of baling wire, a whetstone finer than the one she had. He would not stay to supper more than twice a winter. He said a man who ate another person's beans in a hard month was no kind of neighbor. Hannah Reed came up on the first clear day of every week she could, riding a shaggy mule named Bishop with a sack of bread across her lap and a jar of honey in each coat pocket. And she stayed the night in the shack on a pallet by the stove and taught Elizabeth things she had not yet had time to learn. The making of soft soap from wood ash and tallow, the setting of a snare for winter rabbit, the way to keep a sourdough alive on a shelf above the stove where the cold would not kill it, the reading of a sky for the difference between a 2-day storm and a 2-hour one. On Thursdays, out of long habit, Hannah still baked 2 loaves, and one of them now came up the switchback in a flour sack tied behind her saddle, and Elizabeth kept the second half for Sunday, and ate it slowly, one thick slice a morning with honey and coffee, sitting on the 3-legged stool by the south window as the sun came up over the east ridge. Others came, in their season. A woman named Ada Whitcomb, aged 47, a midwife out of Cedar Pass, who had been at Elizabeth's own birth 22 years earlier and at her mother's death 4 years after that, rode up in late January with a saddlebag of dried herbs and showed Elizabeth which was for fever and which was for a wound gone hot and which was for the cough that lived in cold cabins. And she wrote the names on paper labels in a careful schoolteacher's hand and tied them to the jars with string. A man named Marcus Bailey, aged 36, who ran a small pack outfit out of Fort Larkin and had known Thomas from a season on the trail years before, offered in February to carry Elizabeth's dust down to the assay office in the spring for the standard fee and no more. And she thanked him and told him she would let him know. Peter Ashbrook came up alone one Saturday in March, with a length of hollowed pine he had bored out on his father's lathe and fitted with a small iron spigot, and he sank it into the creek bank above the shack so that Elizabeth could fill her bucket without kneeling on wet gravel, and he ate a bowl of beans at her table and rode down before dark without saying more than 20 words the whole afternoon. She became known by her name. In the Mercantile in Cedar Pass, Meg Tuller said Elizabeth Cooper without a qualifier, not Thomas's girl and not the Cooper girl, only Elizabeth Cooper, and the men at the counter learned to say it that way too. At the Fort Larkin Bank, Alden Purvis marked her deposits in the ledger under her full name and touched the brim of his hat when she came in. At the post office in Cedar Pass, a small canvas sack was set aside for her under a nail marked E. Cooper, and Hannah carried it up to her once a fortnight. She was, without having asked to be, a person of the country. A woman on a claim, in a valley, with a horse and a mare and a shack that was tight against the wind, and a small hidden thing under the ground behind the firs that only she and Hannah, and in a way her father, knew about. Small rituals shaped the winter. Every Sunday morning she took the compass out of the drawer in the plank table where she now kept it, opened it, and set it on the table beside her coffee cup for the length of a slow breakfast. Not out of any belief that it needed to be consulted, but out of a kind of thanks. Every first of the month she opened the ledger and wrote down what had come in and what had gone out, in the plain double column Hannah had taught her at 14, so that a person could not cheat her, and more importantly, so that she could not cheat herself. Every clear evening she stood in the doorway for a minute before going in for the night, and looked down the valley toward the notch where the creek left it, and she counted the horses in the little pole corral Peter Ashbrook had helped her set. 2, always 2, Pilot with his cracked hoof grown out and sound, and Juno standing patient beside him, and she went inside and shut the door and drew the leather latch and slept. The spring came slow to the high valley that year, and Elizabeth watched it come from the doorway of the shack with a tin cup of coffee in her hand and the compass open on the plank table behind her. The creek broke first, running high and brown for a week, and then clearing to the pale green it kept through summer. The grass came up along the south bank in a soft haze before it came anywhere else. Juno foaled early against everyone's expectation, and the colt, wobbly and dark, stood on the third try and nursed on the fourth, and Elizabeth wrote the date in the new ledger under a fresh heading in her own hand. The chinking she had pushed into the north wall through October held through the frosts and the thaw and did not crack. The roof did not leak. The stove drew clean. On the first warm afternoon, she carried the plank table out into the sun and sat at it with the tin box in front of her and read her father's letter through again. Slowly, the way a person reads a thing they already know by heart, and folded it back into its envelope, and put the envelope back into the box, and set the box on the shelf above the bunk where it belonged. She thought of the county recorder in Cedar Pass, and of the paper he had turned around on his desk so she could sign it, and of Harlan Pettyjohn with his leather case tied shut with a bootlace, and of the man from the bank who had walked past Pilot in the corral and marked him off the tally because of a cracked hoof, and she did not think of any of them with bitterness. They had been doing what they were paid to do, and they had been wrong about what they had in front of them, which was a common enough condition among people who worked with paper and did not know the country. Her father had known the country. Her father had panned a creek 9 summers in a row, a little at a time, and filed a claim the spring she turned 14 while she was in Hannah's kitchen learning to render tallow, and had opened an account in her name in a bank 30 miles away when she was 10 and old enough to sit a horse alone but not old enough to be told, and had held all of it quiet. Through the years, the drought took the grass and the bank took the 70 acres along the creek, because the 70 acres were his to lose, and the valley was not. He had left her nothing, the recorder had said. He had left her the one thing he had made sure the note could not touch, and he had left her the compass to bring her to it. And he had left her the sentence he had spoken with his hand on her wrist, and the sentence he had written on the ledger paper folded twice in the tin box, which said the same thing in 2 forms. Hannah rode up on the first Thursday in May with 2 loaves of brown bread in a flour sack, and a small clay pot of new honey, and a cutting of rhubarb wrapped in a wet cloth, to set in the ground behind the shack. And she sat on the 3-legged stool by the south window, and drank coffee from the tin cup that had been on the shelf when Elizabeth first opened the door in October. And she looked at Elizabeth across the plank table and said only that Thomas would be pleased. And then she said nothing more about it, because Hannah had never been a woman who used two sentences where one would do. Elizabeth set the compass on the table between them and opened its lid, and the needle swung the small hair it always swung now and settled and pointed steady up the valley toward nothing in particular, or toward everything. And beside it, Elizabeth laid her mother's handkerchief with the faint smell of rose water still in its folds after 18 years. And the two objects sat there together on the wood in the sunlight through the 4 sound panes. A thing a father had carried in his shirt pocket for 30 years, and a thing a mother had folded and put away before a fever she did not know was coming. And Elizabeth looked at them a long minute, and then closed the compass and folded the handkerchief and put them back where each of them lived. Elizabeth Cooper was 22, and she had been told she had inherited nothing. She had a broken compass in her coat pocket and $12 in coin that a widow down the creek had put into her hand. And with the compass, she had ridden 2 hours by the stars into a high valley she had not seen in 3 years, and she had found a shack her father had built the summer she was 6, and a cellar he had dug the summer after her mother died. And inside the cellar she had found 2 jars of gold dust from 9 summers of a man kneeling alone in a creek, and a claim filed in her name the spring she turned 14, and a bank book from Fort Larkin older than her memory, and a letter that said the place was hers and always was. The compass had not been broken. It had been waiting, and the valley, which the recorder in Cedar Pass had not known about, and the bank had not known about, and Harlan Pettijohn with his boot-laced case had not known about, was the home she had been left, and the shack was the house she had been left. And the work of her hands through a winter was the proof she had been left. And the name that Meg Tuller spoke plain across the counter of the mercantile, and that Alden Purvis entered in the ledger at the bank in Fort Larkin, was the standing she had been left, and it was more than any 70 acres along a creek that a note could take, and it was hers. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and to share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and leave a word in the comments telling us where in the country you are watching from, because we read them, and it matters. And before you go, sit with this. What has someone you loved left you that looked, at first, like nothing at all, and what might it be pointing toward if you followed it?